We'll drink from a pond like a duck.
Alrighty, everyone.
That's a good idea.
Ducks do appreciate water, so there will be plenty of water.
Ducks do appreciate water. Alright. Good to see you all here. Just in the way of announcements, next meeting is not going to be in this room. It is going to be in the Science Building 3.260. It's the room that we were in at the very first part of the year. Announcement will come out to remind you of that on the day of. But, next time we won't be in here. And coming up, not this weekend, but the next weekend, the 21st, October 21st, we are going to be trying to have an RF debate night. Ooh. So, now, what this means is not necessarily us debating. This is us watching a debate and discussing.
Which does evolve into a debate.
Which can evolve into a debate.
Yeah. A friendly dialogue.
Preferably a friendly debate. And probably more of a discussion. But
I've never seen a debate.
Can we appoint a moderator? That would make it a debate.
Aggressive discussion.
hopefully we won't need one. If it gets that aggressive.
If it gets that bad, then one of us will act as moderator.
Yeah. If it gets that bad, then maybe.
We've never had a problem in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But still not entirely sure exactly what debate that's going to be. I'm still kind of looking at some stuff. I'm kind of thinking maybe something on the problem of evil, but we'll see. And that will likely be not here and not really on campus, and the address will obviously be sent out for this, but we'll be at Kenneth's church house that's owned by a church. Anyway, it's a house that's like in Plano. It's kind of like northeastern Plano area, so good 20 minutes from campus. But we'll be having that. We should be having some kind of food stuff. Not entirely sure what it's going to be, but some kind of like decent dinner level.
And you can catch a ride from
Snack
campus if you need.
Yeah, and if anyone needs a ride, just let us know. So there's that, and tonight we were gonna have Justin Bass tonight. I know, like on the TV screens that were in like the SSA and stuff, it was still saying that, but
Oh.
yeah, I
You have to send it in early. And,
yeah. So that ended up getting changed. Sadly, he wasn't able to talk tonight, but we do still have a talk on free will and arguing against naturalism, so it's still going to be interesting. So I'll leave it down.
Okay, thanks, Seth. Yeah. So I needed to fill in, so I kind of just thought about what do I really like to talk about. This is one thing that's like, it's not long enough for a full talk, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to go through this a little bit, and it ties into our science series, so you can think of this as we're adding another half week to our science series to talk about this. And then in the last half, or the last third or so, we'll talk about the reliability of the New Testament with respect to a very narrow argument based on new evidence from names. So I think you'll find that interesting as well. Also not enough content for a full week. So they don't really fit together, but I think you'll enjoy both of them. So we'll jump in here and talk a bit about free will. Just to put this in context, here's what we've been going through the last few weeks. We had the near-death experience, not by being here, but by hearing about it last week. So I think Bo shared some interesting stories that got our attention with respect to that line of evidence. And is there anything that anybody wanted to ask about any of the previous weeks? Was there a burning question or something that happened to be on your mind before we jump in here? Being a fill-in week, we can try to plug in a little extra discussion if there's something on someone's mind. And if not, there's plenty of new things we get into here. So one thing before, just to kind of also, I think we haven't talked a lot about the philosophy of science and how that relates to the series. So we've been trying to show that if you look at science, there's at least some pointers to God. It's not proof, but it's, in my view, it's strong evidence. But in order to make that case, you have to go with sort of a philosophical argument based on science showing certain premises are true, like the universe had a beginning, or the universe requires fine tuning, which seems very unlikely to have happened if the constants of nature were chosen at random, things like that. But people might also, when you sometimes hear people wondering, like, look, God could have made himself known much more clear than he did. And that's a valid question to think about. And in fact, we do have our former president, Brian Bell, is going to speak on the topic of the hiddenness of God later in the semester, so I think you'll enjoy that. But we can briefly interact a little bit with respect to why isn't there more scientific evidence for God? And I think it's important to realize that there are some shortcomings to what science could tell us or not tell us about God. One of the issues is that really modern science itself didn't arise until around the 17th century. And then, of course, many people are not very well trained in science. So yeah, I mean, you've already seen it, like if we get into the guts of the Kalam cosmological argument, you end up talking about some pretty in-depth things that can go over people's heads, and it comes down to like, do you really trust what these cosmologists are saying, or how do you know? So that can be a little bit of a problem. So the other thing I think it's important to realize that we'll get into more the later part of this semester, starting in fact next week, we're going to have Steve Lee give the moral argument for the existence of God, the argument that if there is objective morality, the best explanation of that would be God, some ground of being for morality. But I think we do have some pretty strong evidence that's totally outside of the realm of science itself. Even though I'm a big advocate of science, trained in science, I think the fulfilled prophecy is very powerful when you look at things in the Bible that it predicted long in advance. We've talked about it in the past, so that's the reason we're not covering it this semester. But when you look at the destruction of Babylon or different things like, hey, this city's not only going to be destroyed, but never be rebuilt, that should get your attention if you're a skeptic, like, whoa, that seems hard to predict. At the height of their power, that they would never be rebuilt, even though they're a city along the desert. They're in the desert, they're by a river, why wouldn't you want to rebuild that? But sure enough, it never was. There's many more examples, but that's just kind of a quick change. And then I think you can't really totally discount, even if you're trying to be real careful about evaluating evidence, you can't totally discount religious experience or the evidence of people's changed lives. Why is it that most people that seem to overcome drugs often attribute it to some kind of experience with God getting their attention? But this is kind of a fun little thing that I thought I would show you guys, a little video. Oh, I forgot to check the sound beforehand on this. But this, well, let me just not talk about it until after you see it. But I want you to look at this video, count how many times the players wearing the white pass the ball.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to say that right away. It's been a while since I looked at that. Don't say anything. Just try to count and try to get them home.
The correct answer is 16 passes.
Ooh, nice.
Did you spot the gorilla?
Yes.
People who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
I didn't notice the curtain change at all. That was interesting.
When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
All right.
Was it a real gorilla?
So anyway, just a fun little video that kind of points out, you guys sound like you did way better than average. Everybody, or a lot of people, you don't have to admit it if you didn't see the gorilla. A lot of people apparently were very observant and even got 16 right.
It's part of lifeguard training to watch a variant on the same video.
Oh, is that
I've seen it
right?
like 5 times.
Oh, lifeguard, yeah, that's a good example where you would need that kind of observant aspects. But I think sometimes, especially if you're a naturalist, if you don't believe in God, you're not expecting anything in the way of like intervention. You could miss evidence for God from science, is how that potentially ties in to our overall series. But for tonight, I'm going to give you an argument against naturalism based on free will. But in order to make sense of even what I'm trying to argue for, we have to start off with some definitions. Well, first of all, I think most of you know, but just to be sure, naturalism is the philosophy that claims that nothing exists beyond nature, and thus everything that happens is ultimately traceable solely to natural causes. So most atheists are naturalists. Not all, you could say, but it certainly fits more in that realm. So I'm going against the theory of naturalism, and it's a separate question of, does that for sure pose a problem for atheism? I think it makes it somewhat more difficult to hold that view, but that can be discussed. Free will, now there's different conceptions of free will, but the one that matters for this argument is the common sense notion of free will, that it's so-called libertarian free will. We don't mean the political view of libertarianism, but rather that you can make unforced choices is all that view holds. So if you really think you are in control, yes, we're all influenced by genetics and environment, but if there's even at least one thing that you can do of your own initiative to change something in the world, then you would be considered to have libertarian free will. Okay. So I think you can sense there's a little bit of tension between those, right? So if we can make a good argument that libertarian free will exists, you can see that poses some challenges to naturalism. And I'll argue that it's basically the death knell for naturalism if you can show that. All right. So there is a large number of very intelligent scientists who, I think because of their naturalism, and if you look at their arguments for why there's no free will, they'll generally point to things that depend upon their view of naturalism. And so I think they're being incredibly smart about it, logical about it, but they're starting from a presupposition of naturalism to reach the conclusion that we don't have free will. All right. For example, Francis Crick, most of you probably know, he was the one who elucidated the structure of DNA. Got the Nobel Prize, really sharp guy. And his quote is kind of provocative. He says, "You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Kind of a depressing view in some ways, but it also makes me think, wait a minute, his statement, it's almost like he's saying, my statement that we lack free will is due solely to the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Which wouldn't that then slightly at least undermine, like, well, why do I believe that statement then? If you're saying the only reason you're saying is because of these chemicals happening, how do I know your chemicals are leading you to truth more than my chemicals are? It makes it harder to have rationality if that's your view, I think.
Agreed.
Okay.
It does feel like it's sort of contradicting, because let's be fair, it's obviously going with free will here in the fact that you have a lot of decision making and that you're making some sort of rationale to really make that decision in the first place. But it's also kind of saying that it's more preordained, like it's already made up the mind in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, other prominent atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. I was just listening to a YouTube video of him within the last hour, just trying to get more of a feel for his argument that we don't have free will. And again, everything he appealed to was based on his view of naturalism. And I thought he made a lot of sense. If you start from that, it's really hard to see how you have free will. Because basically on naturalism, if you're saying nature is all there is, there's nothing outside of nature, then anything that you or I do, just like anything that a hurricane does or something, it's all just governed by the laws of nature. You got particles in motion, forces of physics acting on everything. And admittedly, it's a lot more complicated with us as humans in terms of our brains and various things, but to a naturalist perspective, everything going on in your brain is also forced by the laws of nature. It's genetics and environment, and that's it. There's no ability for you to act in a way that's outside of those forces of nature, because there is no outside of the forces of nature on naturalism. Does that make sense? You guys agree on naturalism? There's a bit of a problem there. So there really is no place for the kind of libertarian free will that nearly all of us recognize through firsthand knowledge. So, for example, I could raise my right hand right now. It seems like nothing in this room, the chemicals aren't forcing it. Maybe my brain is, there might be something tricking me, but now I decided to raise my left. It just seems like I'm able to control it. Thoughts?
No, I was just.
Oh, you were doing it. Oh, Rob, okay. I thought you were raising your hand for a point.
But theoretically, you could have something that we would all agree does not have free will, such as a computer, or like have a little robot arm or something.
Sure.
That could seem to take random actions that aren't necessarily necessitated by physical law.
Okay,
But
good point.
are based on predetermined programming.
But you know that it's not because of free will in that scenario, at least, right? Because you just said it's programming.
Yes.
Do you think you could program the computer to have free will?
That's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that raising a right hand and a left, I don't think is necessarily sufficient proof of the existence.
I fully agree with you if you're talking about, like, if I see someone else do it and I don't know enough about them, then I might not know. But when I myself do it, I feel like I have more firsthand knowledge. Now, it could be deceived. I'm going to give you some other reasons to try to go beyond that. But what are your thoughts, Rose?
So I think what's really important is to distinguish kind of what we mean when we talk about free will, because I myself am like a naturalist, as you described.
Sure.
And I believe that, like, exactly as Crick said, it's just like electrical impulses, chemicals. But I don't think that erodes the meaning and the ability for you to perceive that you are making choices, and just like, if we want to use this fun analogy again, if I dealt you a deck of cards, right, and we pulled that royal flush,
We
it's
should
still
play
meaningful
cards
to you because you apply meaning to it, right?
Yeah.
So while technically, I would say people have no free will, we can't just will things to happen simply because we want them to. We have to obey the laws of nature and stuff and reality as we understand.
I certainly agree there's a ton of limits, right?
Right. I wish
Yeah.
I could just snap my fingers and $1 million would appear.
Although I'm not sure that's what people are referring to when they talk about free will. We were talking about it more along the lines of like manifesting.
Right, what I'm saying is, it's kind of how we use the term theory to describe both something we kind of posit as like a conspiracy theory, or in scientific circles, they say theory to mean,
Like germ theory or something.
right, like fact, right, as close to fact as we can get. It has different meanings in different contexts, and I think when
Yeah.
we colloquially use the term free will, we mean, manifesting. But if I were to describe it myself, I would say the sort of self-assigned meaning that humans say is like what they choose to do.
I don't think, I've never encountered someone who, when they hear free will, would think of manifesting versus the ability to choose to do otherwise.
I believe that when people are referring to free will, they don't necessarily mean the ability to will nothing out of existence or to defy every natural law. They mean being able to do what they choose with the circumstances and the laws which they reside in. And so I don't necessarily believe that the inability for us to manifest nothing into existence or to defy natural laws negates free will.
I wasn't saying that as like an example of free will, I was just saying that as a joke. in reference to not being able to change reality.
Right,
Yes,
right.
The stipulation still stands, yes? Oh, thank you.
Well, I think one thing you could say as well is that there are a lot of naturalists who would say that, yeah, I make choices all the time, but they would, on their view, I think, have to admit that it is things going on in their brain. It's all nature that's forcing it, but you are making choices that make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the only way this argument works is if you really can go beyond whatever's going on in your brain and actually make a difference.
Right, it seems like if you want this argument to land for someone who is like a, I guess, not a naturalist per se, because they wouldn't believe in a soul, but like next to it, they would need to believe in like some sort of soul or some sort of ghost in the machine that is making the decisions and not just the machine itself.
Yeah, that's the very thing we're trying to evaluate. It's like, is there evidence for some ability to go beyond nature and make a decision? But what are your thoughts, Seth?
I was just gonna say, I feel like any kind of libertarian free will of any sort, whether it's manifesting something or anything like that, just making a free decision, I don't know, that seems to throw a real wrench in the laws of physics. I mean, if everything is deterministic, and then suddenly this person makes a free rational decision, that means that they just caused something without having anything causing them to do
That's why Crick and Harris would say that, they
I
make
feel like
decisions,
anything,
but
like
they're
you
caused
are
by the laws of
manifesting
nature.
something new in that case.
It would
Because,
be less like without anything causing it, without anything decisively causing it, but
oh, yeah,
that's
I mean,
semantics.
you're caused by your parents are caused, like,
Yeah.
different causes, but, directly causing it, there's no collision of molecules you could point to say that's what made you make
Yeah, it's hard to
that decision.
picture, for me anyway, like what forced me to raise my hand at this
Yeah.
moment and then that hand at that moment.
Yeah, so if there's
But
even
maybe
one
there is, maybe I'm
case-
somehow tricked, and we will talk about some other things relevant. What do you think, Samuel, as a neuroscience grad student here?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to think, to be completely honest. I'm not really sold on the naturalism idea, but maybe like a Kierkegaard leap of faith kind of deal. I have to sort of believe in free will. But man, you see like evidence of subconscious processing, and you can predict things occurring before you consciously perceive that it's occurring, and it's sort of like,
Are you referring to the Libet experiments by any chance, or there's other ones as well?
I mean, this is.
We're gonna talk a
I think
little bit about
literature.
those, yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
those are worth exploring for
yeah,
sure.
definitely.
Okay. All right, so let's bring in a little bit of information from neuroscience. One of the interesting things to me is that neuroscientists will sometimes, brain surgeons will do surgery on a patient sometimes where they'll keep the patient awake. And they can do that because the brain you don't have any pain sensors inside the brain. Of course, you have to do something at the scalp level and all, but local anesthesia. And that way they can tell if they're cutting into the brain, like, well, what is the impact? And so they discovered it is really interesting, right? A lot of motions are very localized in the brain, like how you move your arm. There's a certain area for that, or for vision, things like that. And people have mapped the brain. Sometimes it changes the brain. There's the neuroplasticity that we talked about last week, that it can be moved around, but it's pretty interesting. But one thing that I find significant potentially is that they've never been able to stimulate somebody to move, their arm or leg or whatever in such a way that they thought that they themselves did it, okay? So they can always say, oh, doc, you caused that to happen during the surgery, right? And so that's kind of interesting, right? It's like they can't find something in the brain that seems to be tied into agency, which on naturalism, you would think at least that may be quite likely. All right, and I do think that it should afford some level of evidence just that we have this direct first-person experience. So Rob pointed out a good thing in terms of like, you can have a computer, or let's say, a robot dressed up as a computer in the far future, maybe it could trick people, right? Like you programmed it, you know it has no free will, but it could say the same thing I just said and do the same thing, and it might trick you, right? If it was, done well enough. So I agree, I don't have very good evidence from someone else saying it, but when I do it myself, it's hard for me to say that that doesn't at least, give me some level of evidence of free will, that I have this experience of being able to control my environment. And I think humans sort of take that for granted. At least, you could say everybody's deceived, but there's strong evidence from the way people live their life that they believe that they can control, their world. And in fact, some of the problems that people have psychologically is when they don't think they have any control and have no agency in the world. That can lead to some very dark places for people. So I think a lot of people live their lives as though we're making unforced choices, that we're making decisions. And I think it does at least pose some issues, as we talked about before, towards even, reason itself. If you start saying everything that goes on in your brain is a result of natural processes, how do I know that my belief in naturalism wasn't itself just some weird action of atoms, and does that give you some reason to potentially undermine it? So normally, no, I think I've unpacked that enough. Let's keep moving on so we can get to other things. Think about our legal system. So we do punish premeditated murder, first-degree murder, worse, because we think, well, that person was planning to kill them. That's more guilt-worthy than if two guys were fighting and it just got overheated and somebody wasn't thinking and accidentally killed somebody. That's two different things, right? We punish the rapist for imposing his will on the victim against her will. If you do away with free will altogether, how can you necessarily even really deal with crime? In fact, people like Dawkins and other famous atheist naturalists will admit that, like, hey, we're too focused on punishing criminals. They would all say, yeah, you might need to segregate people that are dangerous to society, but they would try to make the case, Sam Harris and others, that they just have something defective. You can't really blame them for their crimes. So that's different, at least, than the majority of people and the way that we tend to view others. If somebody wronged you, you're upset at them because you think they could have done otherwise, right? And in fact, yeah, if you're raped at gunpoint on naturalism, that's caused by physical processes in a similar way to any other sex. So that's kind of a weird thing to think about, I think. What are your thoughts, Rose?
I mean, yeah, that's true, but I think it's just a really misleading statement. Being kissed on the lips is also a physical process, right? But we understand that these physical processes have impacts on people. So I think sort of saying as if they're the same is, yeah.
It might get back more to, if you want to try to argue that, okay, yeah, people are making choices, but maybe they're caused by just things going on in their brain or their environment. But you want to hold people accountable for the choices they make. But I think it does pose some issues in terms of even evaluating the criminal justice system. If you say that, well, really everything that everybody does is just equally due to the laws of nature, they don't really have any control over it in one sense on that view. What do you think, Greta?
I mean, I feel like you could just say, okay, we're not going to do it to punish the person per se, but just as a deterrent, because even if everything is natural, we can still observe that people are less likely to murder people.
You still need to protect. Yeah, all of these people would say, yeah, we need to protect, the innocent from the people that are causing these problems.
So why do they believe in objective moral values on naturalism? In that case, so why do we?
That's next week. In a lot of detail next week.
Duties in particular are not so that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. What else, Sam?
I do find this topic interesting. I want to know where everyone's limit is. So there's this guy, Robert Sapolsky. He's a neurobiologist at Stanford, And he would say, similar to like a Sam Harris naturalist argument, that it's inappropriate for us to punish anybody because it is just simply a manifestation of their own biological processes. And one example that's commonly used is performing exorcisms on children with epilepsy, and how at one time that was considered couth, but now we have an understanding of the neurobiological processes involved. We don't think it's demonic possession, and therefore we no longer would perform exorcisms on children with seizures. There have been cases of people getting off from crimes based on things like fMRI data and genetic analysis showing that there's this pop psychology thing where there was this thing called the warrior gene that was somewhat related to aggression. It was correlated with aggression, and somebody actually, I believe, got off on a crime for having the warrior gene. So it's like, where do we draw the line of what is enough of a biological contribution that we don't punish the person versus we punish the person?
Yeah, you get into a lot of issues like that on the more naturalistic side of the equation there. What do you want to add? Go ahead.
Whenever it harms someone else's well-being, especially at the expense of their human rights, that is when you need to take action to prevent it from happening.
Well put. Seems like a good criterion. Yep. Either way, you can for sure try to protect the innocent on either view. Other implications, if you really truly have no libertarian free will, one of the challenges for me would be that it seems to undermine sort of people being heroes or villains if everything they do is just solely determined by the laws of nature. For example, Martin Luther King, we all view him as a great civil rights leader, right? But if no one has free will, in what sense, what does that undermine the notion of rights to some degree? Or if Martin Luther King only did what he did because, not because he was heroic and striving to help, his people and these oppressed peoples, but just because the laws of nature made him do it. It has a little bit of this, that doesn't seem to sit right with how I view the man. I think that's one of the challenges, at least, I think, for the person who wants to defend naturalism and there not being any free will, is no one would ever really freely choose to be either courageous or sacrificial, or, on the other hand, no one is choosing to be a dictator. Stalin, Hitler, they're just acting according to their environment, which, I think, yes, they might have had some genes that made them more inclined to do that, but I don't think you can totally excuse their behavior. I just don't see it. All right, and yeah, we'll talk a lot more next week about the issue of morality. So this ties in a little bit with that, because I think if you don't have free will, that at least undermines the whole notion of morality to some degree. What do you think, Kenneth?
I'm wondering how, this is probably, sorry if this question gets us down a rabbit hole, but if this kind of thing points against naturalism, does it also point against Calvinism?
I think it does, actually. I don't believe in the extreme version of Calvinism anyway, where they would want to say that we don't have freedom, but God is ordaining every possible thing. And the problem I have with that is you then make God the author of evil.
So I think we're talking about a different definition of free will once we start talking about Calvinism.
I would want to say that not all, I would say most Calvinists don't go to that extreme either. I know we probably have Calvinists in this room that are, I think have views that are fine, but I'm talking about the extreme version. Yeah.
I was wondering if this is an alternative or I guess, neo-naturalist view, where we posit that the brain is an apparatus instead of just being determined by natural laws. It still is deterministic in the sense that it can only act within the limits of what it's exposed to, but not necessarily because of the specific chemicals or genes, but because tabula rasa.
Is what?
Yeah.
Tabula rasa is an empirical, an empiricist statement, phrase that says blank slate. So it's
that's
positing
right.
that every human brain, when humans are conceived, it is a blank slate, and from then on, we are exposed to different sort of things, and so the kind of actions, the algorithm, the contents of the algorithm of the brain that a person in the middle of South Africa would be different than the contents of the algorithm that a person would possess in this room.
Sure.
And so I wonder if that's also a naturalistic view, just this idea that
I mean, I can agree with a lot of that, even though as a Christian theist, I mean, I believe that humans have a non-physical component, but I could say the brain itself is solely subject to the laws of physics. There might be random quantum things going on or whatever, but
Still physics.
it's just, but I think there's something else. That's the soul, that's the dualist view that Bo was arguing for last week as well.
Perception itself, I believe, falls apart if it doesn't operate on non-physical attributes. But what I was wondering is, even if we were to take it away from just an empirical argument and say that we are only what we are exposed to, then is that also a naturalist argument, I wonder?
I feel like that if you're saying that the brain can be affected, if you're saying the brain is not purely dependent on chemicals and biological processes and stuff like that, you've kind of already stepped away from naturalism, right?
Oh,
Naturalism
I'm so sorry.
I mean, a lot of what you're focused on though is like the strong view of the environmental aspect to
Nature versus
influences.
nurture,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
You could still have that on naturalism, right? Like,
yeah, you could. They
Yeah.
might
Yeah.
de-emphasize the genetic component over the environment,
I
but
think what I was positing is more of like a Deleuzian argument, like the desiring machine and stuff like that.
all right, let's let Sam make one more comment and then we'll move on.
Oh, it was a question. I just wanted to try and understand what the seat of free will is for most people. Because I think like a problem with something like a blank slate is if you're talking about anatomically, it's simply just not the case that we are blank slates, right?
Right.
So it's like, what is the blank slate? I'm just having trouble wrapping my
On
My
that,
head
so
around.
that's a question for Cello, more of like, on that view, what did they, yeah, can you expound
I'd
on
say
that?
that, so, oh, jeez. From what I've gleaned is, there are contending views on it, but some argue that it's the lack of biases, prejudices, and then, or even just, so when empiricism, fun history lesson, when empiricism was rising into prominence, it was against its antithesis, which was more of an idealist point of view, that asserted that we have faculties of the mind which are already installed within us when we are put into this world, and we have ideas of forms of the good, forms of things, and so when we perceive objects, there are aspects in us that are already installed to be able to perceive perceive our surroundings. But what the empiricists were trying to say is, no, we are born in a blank slate where we don't necessarily possess these higher understandings of forms or these metaphysical faculties. What we are is just a blank algorithm ready to consume whatever is waiting out for us in the world.
I see. Okay, thank you.
All right,
You could distill that maybe to a sense perception on the empiricist side versus like maybe almost instinctual knowledge on the idealist side, if I'm understanding that correctly. Is that right?
it sounded right to me, that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on then. That is an interesting whole area that probably is getting a little bit more focused on tangential parts slightly, but, so I mean, yeah, you could, as a naturalist, could still just say, okay, yeah, you have the strong sense that you have free will, but you're just tricked. So let's kind of unpack that, think through that a little bit more. One challenge to that I would offer would be that I don't see exactly how that's supposed to have evolved on a sort of a Darwinian evolutionary account. So as long as we have agency, I think it's easy to see how consciousness plays a role that natural selection could favor, for example. Let me get the point out, and then, so I see 3 hands already. But if you take away libertarian free will, what role then would consciousness play? Do you need to have this kind of subjective experience of evaluating things in order to make a decision? It seems a bit superfluous, and many naturalists, in fact, are led to a view called epiphenomenalism, which is sort of saying that consciousness plays no role because it doesn't need to, and it's questionable how it even could. Even if you bring to mind something about your environment, how are you free to act on it? It's more like you're programmed to act on it. So evolution could certainly explain how you could be programmed to respond to certain stimuli, but it seems to me it's very difficult to explain how you can freely, why you would ever have this subjective experience at all on naturalism in order to be fooled to thinking that you have free will. Yes?
Admittedly, have you ever said a word so often that it stops sounding like a word? From a naturalist perspective on evolution, not everything that develops in an organism happens for a reason, right? Some things are just
Spandrels, as they say, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, I've heard the term before, but I didn't want to use it because I was using it wrong. So it is theoretically possible, as far as I can tell, that the perception of consciousness is effectively a spandrel of.
It's possible. I wouldn't deny that, no. Yeah, go ahead, Liz. What else would you offer?
If you compare it to like computer programs, for instance, if we set up a program to solve a maze, where all it does is just follow one of the walls and traces it, it'll eventually solve the maze.
Right.
But it'll take a while, right? But if you ask ChatGPT to solve the maze and you give it hundreds of examples, it can solve the maze pretty good because it has the ability to change its model for how it solves problems,
Right.
instead of just being the same every time.
Okay.
Which
Yeah.
is
Absolutely.
probably advantageous.
But it doesn't have any subjective experice,
That we know
ChatGPT,
of.
right? So I'm not sure that refutes necessarily
I know how you asked it.
this. That would be interesting to see its response.
I'm about to start the AI revolution by asking it.
What if we just ask-
There was a bizarre story of the Google engineer who claimed something was sentient and got booted, but.
Oh, the Lambo.
It says that it has not had subjective experiences.
Oh, okay.
Take it from the AI. It's
I
not
like that
sentient.
you asked in real time there.
It's a very atheistic response that he gave.
No, I mean, that's accurate. So, yeah, I think that I would like to hear a plausible evolutionary account for why we would have the illusion of free will. At most, it's a spandrel, it's something that's a byproduct that serves no purpose. But consciousness itself, if it's physical, it must have some metabolic expense. It must, it must cost something to an organism for it to develop. It's one of the things we value the most, right? Is that, we're conscious, that we have this experience. And if you say that that's just epiphenomenal, it doesn't help you with making free will decisions, I don't see that, for me anyway, it doesn't fit well with my perception of humans, my understanding of how we all act in the world. So for me, at least, it seems to be some evidence against naturalism based on this experience of free will and consciousness. So yeah, why would natural selection favor giving humans an illusion of free will if it serves no purpose? And if it does serve a purpose, what would that purpose really be? If you're not choosing, then your subjective experience, it's hard to see how that would necessarily make a difference. You could still program the maze solver, you could still program humans to respond to whatever stimuli without adding to it any kind of consciousness or subjective experience. Or at least that's the argument. All right, we've already talked about that. There's also interesting aspects that I think was it you, Kenneth, that, no, somebody brought this up last week, I'm not sure Bo understood what was being referenced. But when they do the split brain surgery for people that are severe epileptics, they have these horrible seizures that go from one side of the brain to the other. They found that if they literally just sever all the connections between the right and left side of the brain, that their epilepsy will get much better. But interestingly, they find that they still have a unified conscious experience, even though there's a few subtle differences where their left vision and their right arm have a lot harder time doing certain things. Somebody wanted a Nobel Prize for the research. But people like Michael Egnor that do these surgeries report that when they interview the patients, and I found some peer-reviewed articles in my own research that affirms that, yeah, this is in fact, the uniform reporting of those patients. Did you have something to add to that, Samuel?
Do you think learning is a conscious experience?
I think normally it is. I wouldn't necessarily want to be committed to saying that all learning is. Like, I understand sometimes people cement memories in their sleep, or you might be able to learn some subconsciously, but I would think that the normal, the bulk of it would be more.
What about like dogs learning danger? Like, this place is dangerous. Do you think that's conscious?
I really don't know as much about what dogs would experience as
Or what if
humans.
like a little kid knows this place is dangerous, and he learns that? Do you think that's like a conscious?
Yeah, maybe not as much, right? He might be picking up on a lot of subtle cues and integrating them together in a way that he couldn't necessarily articulate, or that we couldn't either if we were in his shoes. What are your thoughts, Seth?
Now, I am not a psychologist or anything of the like, but from my incredibly base level knowledge, it sounds like we're kind of getting into the difference between like higher level learning and just like something more like operant conditioning, or classical conditioning, or just something like that, something that's more just automatic. And I feel like there's a line between that and like learning a math problem, or
And even more than that, iterative algorithms. Machine learning programs.
But you can't like Pavlov yourself to hunt. That's a skill that has to be learned, which is a result of being conscious.
Yeah.
Also, when they do the brain stimulation, they don't, they can't stimulate you to do like calculus or deep philosophy, or there's no single part of the brain engaged when you're doing certain abstract things like that, which is interesting. All right, but yeah, let's talk about these interesting experiments, because there are some naturalists that would push back and say, look, we have some scientific evidence that you don't have free will, and so we need to respond to that. So this is a pretty good short video that will introduce us to the topic, and then we'll discuss it.
First, you presumably first had a thought.
I don't know why that skipped the first word. Let's try again.
Put your hand in front of you and flex your wrist. You presumably first had a thought. Flex my wrist. That then caused your wrist to move. That's how it seems. But Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s have cast some doubt on that. In his neuroscience lab, he wired up subjects to an EEG machine measuring brain activity via electrodes on their scalps, and then asked them to choose to perform a simple hand movement when they felt like it. He also got them to record the time at which they made a conscious decision to move their hands. Disconcertingly, he found evidence of brain activity initiating the movement hundreds of milliseconds before the conscious decision was reported. In other words, his experiments seemed to show that the conscious decision didn't cause the movement. The brain activity bringing about movement started before the individual willed anything to happen. Some people think this is proof that free will is an illusion, that our conscious decisions are more like reports on what is already happening than the causes of our action. Libet didn't go that far. He thought that we might not have free will, but there's still time for what some have called free won't, a conscious veto of an action that is started in the brain. Others are more skeptical about the implications of these experiments. They point out difficulties of recording the time of a subjective decision to move, and question whether Libet's findings could apply to more complex conscious decisions based on reasons, such as the decision to reject the claim that Libet's experiments undermine our idea of free will.
I think that's a pretty fair summary of the Libet experiments, and yeah, he definitely was a big advocate of what he referred to there as free won't. That he saw no evidence whatsoever for any signals in the brain prior to negating a choice, like if you decided not to do something. Even if you had this prompting that you wanted to do it, you could decide not to do it, and they could never detect that in advance. So it's interesting though, because there's been a lot of people weigh in on this. And by the way, Daniel Dennett, one of the ones skeptical of the implications from the experiments, he himself was one of the 4 atheist horsemen. So he can't be accused of bias in that sense. John Searles, he's famous for the Chinese room, which we could talk about sometime, which is a really important thought experiment. But he argues in a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences article that the experiments show that the original experiments were actually flawed. If you ask the subjects to look at a clock and decide not to perform an action, you get the same readiness potential that you could measure in the brain slightly before an action. As far as we can tell, the readiness potential was produced by watching the clock. Take away the clock and there is no readiness potential. Interestingly, Searles, I should have actually clarified, Searles is the second quote, not the first. I believe the history of the readiness potential is an unfortunate chapter in recent scientific history, and it raises a question: why were people so eager to believe these implausible conclusions? The answer, I think, is they wanted to discredit consciousness. Consciousness has typically been an embarrassment to the natural sciences. So there is a sense in which people just really jumped on some of these experiments and tried to read into them things which the people doing the experiments were not willing to say, and also things that would just fit better in naturalism, but really weren't substantiated by the experiments themselves. A more recent version by John Dylan Haynes, he thought he also had challenged free will, but he later had to conclude a person's decisions are not at the mercy of unconscious and early brainwaves. They're able to actively intervene in the decision-making process and interrupt a movement. People previously have used the preparatory brain signals to argue against free will. Our study now shows that the freedom is much less limited than previously thought. Okay, so I think there's really no good reason from science for thinking that we don't have free will. There's other articles by some French and German neuroscientists that reach similar conclusions. Any last thoughts on that? And then I want to jump in. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to briefly give you this one argument on a different topic here. So yeah, I just want to give you an interesting thing that's discovered in the last few decades when we've been able to put together a database of ancient names of Jews from first century Palestine. And so you can do an assessment on the New Testament documents to see if they were using realistic names for characters. It's kind of an interesting test. It may not go that far towards proving a whole lot, but I find it very interesting whenever you can evaluate new data and really see where does the evidence point. Because as you'll see, we can show that a 2nd century fraudulent gospel got the names totally messed up. And that alone, you could pretty much show that this could not have been written in the 1st century by eyewitnesses talking about real people living in the area. It just doesn't fit.
Question, which 2nd century gospel are we talking
Judas.
about here? Oh, Judas, okay.
The Gospel of Judas, yeah. Wow. All right. So, I mean, yeah, think about it. If you guys were making up a story of, say, Mexico 50 years ago, how hard would it be to choose names? I mean, we can all think of a few, right? Jose and Juan and this and that. But would you get the frequency right? And would you really get enough of a diversity of names typically used?
Real question is, can you do it without Google?
Right. Yeah. Or, go to like France in the 18th century. It gets a lot harder the more you're removed from the culture. But, as it turns out, even by conservative scholars would admit that these Gospels were probably written in areas outside of where the events take place. I mean, some of the Jews were driven away by persecution or early Christians. So there's reasons for that, and it's not to say these were not either eyewitness. The claim among the Christians anyway would be these are either eyewitnesses or they interviewed eyewitnesses. And so they had reliable material, but they would admit that, yeah, they probably wrote it in places like Rome or Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. They were not in those areas even when they were writing it. They were having to rely on their memory. All right, and just pointing out names, I have to admit I'm not that great at names. I'm sorry if I've forgotten y'all's names at different points and so forth, but we can remember sometimes a movie we see or something, you'll remember a lot about the plot. Sometimes you'll forget names, or you'll meet people and you'll remember a bunch of stuff they said, but you can't remember their name, right? Because names don't really, there's not a flow of information. Not everyone I meet named Rob is like the Rob at the back of the room there. Some Robs are just totally different, so I have no way of associating it. So what they've done is they've looked at, it turns out we have a lot of these bone boxes or ossuaries in this very narrow time window when the Jews had this sort of funerary practice. I actually did a master's thesis on this, so I researched it quite a bit, but they've been able to compile then a list of names from first century Palestine and evaluate that. And so Talalan is one of the ones that's done this in detail. Richard Bauckham, a really top scholar in the UK, has also kind of reported on the summary of the findings. And one interesting thing is that the names in Palestine, I'm using that name just to refer to Israel, Judea, that whole area, without trying to get into political issues. They actually had totally different frequency than names elsewhere, like in Asia Minor. Even Jews living there, or say in Egypt, had different names. Okay, so it made it a little bit harder to get the names right because of that. But here's what they found from the database. You have a certain, just kind of listed in order of most common. So Simon, you have a lot of Simons in the Bible, right? Simon Peter, Simon the tanner, Simon the leper, Simon the high priest. And so, yeah, you have a bit of a correlation between what's most common in the New Testament and what's most common in this database of all known names from the time period. So it seems quite plausible. I mean, you could analyze this mathematically and show that it's the kind of thing you would expect. Whenever you're taking a random subsample, it never matches perfectly, as you know if you've ever studied statistics, but it's pretty close. In fact, so like the top two names, 15.6% of the men mentioned in the New Testament have the names Simon and Joseph. And it's, in New Testament times, but in the New Testament itself, it's 18.2. Similar results, the top 9 men's names kind of match up. Women, they didn't have as much variety of names at the time. The poor women, 28% were named either Mary or Salome, but that also fits within the New Testament. So it looks like they were reporting about real people. Again, that may seem very modest and so forth, but the more of these you stack together as you try to evaluate the New Testament evidentially, I think you see a picture emerging that they knew about the places they were talking about. They seem to be talking about real people. There seemed to be a story that wasn't just made up. So here's the point I made earlier that, hey, in Egypt, Jewish names were quite different than Palestine. So yeah, you don't find people commonly named this in our society today, right? Other than Joseph and Samuel, I guess, but Ptolemaeus and Pappus, and these are very rare because they were not in the Bible, and therefore they didn't have as much of a cultural influence in our times. All right, we showed that already. One of the things that I find most interesting is the whole notion of disambiguation. So you probably remember seeing that term right on when you do a Wikipedia search or something, and it's like, oh, there's these other things but the same name, you have to disambiguate which person of this certain name are you talking about or whatever. So you find in the New Testament, just as I mentioned all the Simons, every time it mentions a Simon, it has to give this qualifier so that you know, well, which Simon are we talking about? That's the most common name in the area. And it just does this very casually without drawing attention to it in the New Testament text. And it's only the people that have the most common names for which you see that practice. So this is a good example from the listing of the disciples. As many of you know, there were 12 disciples. Here's a passage in Matthew where it lists them. The numbers shown here represent their rank in terms of popularity in the time. So you have Simon called Peter. So it's like you've got to give this guy a different name or it's going to get real confusing. And Andrew's brother. Andrew didn't even make the top 100, so we don't have a number by that. James, we better specify, he's the son of Zebedee. And John is his brother. Obviously, he's got a qualifier by virtue also of being the son of Zebedee. Then it lists Philip and Bartholomew with no qualifiers. Why? Because they're 50th and 63rd in the list of names. Thomas, no qualifier, not top 100. Matthew, he's number 9, so we better say, that's a tax collector. James, which James? Son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, that's enough to say, he's only 39 on the list. And then we have already another Simon in the disciples, Simon the Zealot. Or Z if you watch Chosen, right? It's a pretty good show. Judas Iscariot, also a qualifier. So I think that's interesting. That really looks like they're talking about real people from that time period. This isn't just a made-up story. Also, there's realism in the details when it's talking about Jesus. So Jesus is the 6th most common name in first century Palestine. So what's interesting is that whenever you see the crowd, someone talking about Jesus in a situation where there's a crowd, you'll see them specify which Jesus, like Jesus of Nazareth or something like that. But in the text, if you're reading the book of Matthew, by the time you get to the 20th chapter, you know the Jesus they're talking about. He's been talking about it for 20 chapters. So the narrator will not tell you which Jesus. He's just like, Jesus, they did just as Jesus had told them. And then a few verses later, it said the crowds, I think that's supposed to say said, sorry. This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. And the narrator says, Jesus went in the temple. He doesn't need to specify. And this is the pattern throughout. I looked at a bunch of different chapters and cross-checked some of what the scholars were saying, and it totally matched. Whenever you see the same thing in Matthew 26, Simon Peter was a very common name, but here we're talking about Jesus. Jesus the Galilean, he says Peter was with Jesus the Galilean. You got to specify which one. You can't just say this guy was with Jesus. You've got to show which one. Same thing, either Jesus of Nazareth, and the narrator doesn't use that. So it's obvious the narrator, when he's quoting speech, when people would need to use these kind of disambiguators, they would. So I find that kind of interesting. These very small details do support the notion that this, again, it's very modest. It's part of a very broad cumulative case that you'll see a lot more detail on later, where you also see the authors in the New Testament know a great deal about, for example, the complex interaction of Rome running Palestine, right? You've got these Jewish leaders they put in place, and also Rome, and they've got these governors. It's all very confusing, but the New Testament authors nail it in all respects, and they get these customs right. They talk about tiny cities. They're writing this in Turkey to people that have no idea if they're, when they talk about Cana of Galilee, they have no idea if they're just making up a city name or not. They could have gotten away with lying if they wanted to, but they didn't. And even what they chose to write about, you don't see them putting words on Jesus's lips that the early church wanted to find out about, like, how do we deal with all these Gentiles in the early church, or things like that. They don't necessarily, there's evidence that they are not forcing into Jesus's mouth things that were of importance in that time period. Yeah?
Were there other texts that could have been passed down over the years that held the common names like this that people later could have used?
I would say not really. Names would change pretty rapidly, especially after the dispersion that was the result of the Roman persecution. It got really bad at 130 AD. And then, you don't have as many writings. It's not a very literate culture. you do have names recorded in the ossuaries, but people are not often like going, especially once the Jews were kicked out of the area by the Romans after they rebelled. They're not going back and even having access to these burial areas to see older names. Now, the Jews would tend to keep genealogy, so I guess you could argue they might have some of that through that information, potentially, but it would be difficult. It was much more difficult then than it is now to get any kind of information. And that's why it's important to evaluate all these things about geography and what kind of trees are in different areas. All this stuff in the New Testament checks out to be accurate where you can test it. Seth?
Well, and I'd say that seems to imply that they, the writers of the Gospels in the future, went back to make sure all the names were right, anticipating someone would look through all of the ossuary boxes, tally up a list, make a percentage, go through and see. It just, I don't think people at that time period would have expected that.
If you were trying to even pull off a conspiracy, it would not have been front of mind to
try
to come up with this elaborate thing that didn't help you at all at the time, but maybe went a little bit later and in some modest sense.
Especially in a society without Google, that like people can't like fact check. Oh, what are the most common names in Judea? Like,
there wasn't even like, you know, the only, if you go to a library like in Rome, you could find some geography books just barely, but it was like, here's the great places to visit in the world before you die. Yeah. It was never about the backwaters of Palestine, and especially the area Jesus was from. Galilee was, you know, it was looked down by the Jews in the other part of the country, so.
Yeah, and even if one really learned man in Rome cracked all of this, it's not like he's gonna like put it on the Roman internet and it like gets to the random Jewish farmers who are reading it. Like it wouldn't really make a difference.
They just didn't care, you know, rightfully so. These are tedious details, so.
Yeah.
So yeah, here is just in closing then, so we can look at the other Gospels, which we have good reasons for thinking all of them came at least 100 years later and therefore were not written by the authors to whom they were proposed to have been written by, despite what like the Da Vinci Code or something might suggest, which, you know, remember that is just a novel. And even people like Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, are very critical of the Da Vinci Code. But apparently some professors sometimes still talk about aspects of it as though it were actually accurate. But anyway, like in the Da Vinci Code, they talk about all these other Gospels. What about these other Gospels? Really, there's not as many as that book claimed. And the ones that we do know about, we have very good reasons for things that came later. You never see them quoted by someone in the 1st century or early 2nd century or anything like that. So one of them is the Gospel of Thomas. It does seem to quote some things from the New Testament. In fact, one reason we know that came much later is there was a copy of Matthew in the language of Syriac that had a translation error that they propagated from that, one of their quotes. And so it shows pretty obviously it had to be written after about 150 AD, and therefore Thomas would have been long dead. He's thought to have died a martyr's death in India, by the way. I've had many Indians tell me that they think there's strong evidence for that in India. Gospel of Mary. The point I'm making here, though, is that we don't even have many names mentioned in these other Gospels. Like they're not even really trying. Gospel of Mary has more than most. But the one that's really interesting is the Gospel of Judas, as I mentioned earlier, because it does have a lot of names, but it has not hardly any that intersect with 1st century Palestine outside of supposedly Judas Iscariot, who wrote it, who was made out to be the hero, by the way. The betrayer was made to be the hero. And of course, it does talk about Jesus. And it mentions names like Barbalos, Sophia, things that are not anywhere to be found in the ossuaries of 1st century Palestine. Now you might think Adam and Eve, Michael and Gabriel were angels mentioned in the Old Testament. But yeah, if you look at the names, not even those show up in the list. So I think this shows an example of how, if you are making up a story, this kind of evidence could detect that as being fraudulent. All right, I think that's a good stopping place. That's the end of the names part of the talk. So, yeah, real quick comment or question?
Actually, this does remind me of when I took understanding art class from I graduated a lot of years.
Okay.
This was like during COVID, and I'll admit that this was the second time I did it. The first time I kind of just withdrew early. Second time it was a little different. We talked about Leonardo da Vinci, but it actually kind of, the thing is, my professor always mentioned, we always should call him Leonardo and not Da Vinci, because Da Vinci was referencing the fact that he was from the town of Vinci, actually.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what this kind of reminded me of. Anyway, the thing is, from this is that you can tell that there's a lot of detailing and effort to really make sure that this is as robust as possible in terms of just like being realistic, at least being based on something. It's not just like someone haphazardly written down some fan fiction or whatever. It's not like that.
Exactly, yeah.
There's
It doesn't get you real far, but.
Too much effort to even not fake any of this, really, and it does, but it does, I mean, that's good. The whole Judas thing was kind of interesting, because now I do remember Seth, Yobel, and I was like, what? Adam, Eve, and then Michael and Gabriel.
Okay.
I was looking at these names, I was like, oh, wow.
Yeah, they
Now
knew,
it's just-
they knew the Old Testament some, so they use some names from there that don't seem as foreign to us, but even those are not really showing up on the list, but the other ones seem, yeah, quite foreign. Interesting, yeah. All right, do we have a place, Seth, for where people are gonna go out to grab a bite to eat afterwards?
Yeah, we reached the end of the places where we usually go to, the end of the list, so I was thinking let's just start right back at the beginning at Taco Bell, since that's the
Okay.
first one we went to.
Pretty close by.
Nice
so-
on campus, everything, and it's a nice night tonight, so.
It's cheap. There you go.
And it's
Sounds
cheap.
good. And it won't be as crowded as it was the first week.
And it won't be 100 degrees.
Yes, even more so.
Yay.
All right, well, thank you guys for coming, and I'll be around if anyone wants to talk about any of this anymore. Thank you.
We'll take you over just a mess anyway.
And we ended just a little bit early, huh?